Hello everyone, and welcome back to our channel. The world stage has been incredibly active lately, with numerous significant events unfolding across the globe. Today, we're zeroing in on a particularly riveting development in international trade relations that could have far-reaching consequences. We'll delve deep into the escalating trade tensions, potential shifts in policy, and the strategic maneuvering between major economic players. Stick around until the end, as we'll be synthesizing all these points and offering some key conclusions. Before we dive in, if you find value in our analysis and want to stay updated on crucial economic and political events, please consider subscribing to our channel and hitting that like button. It truly helps us grow and continue bringing you this content. Also, let us know in the comments where you're tuning in from. We love hearing from our global audience. Well, ladies and gentlemen, it has certainly been a dynamic start for Donald Trump and the unfolding situation surrounding what some are terming Liberation Day. This day marks a point where numerous reciprocal tariffs are anticipated to come into effect. The precise details concerning which nations will face these retaliatory tariffs are still emerging. We're closely monitoring for official announcements to get the full picture. However, we do know that both Israel and Vietnam have already taken significant steps. Reports indicate they have eliminated most, if not all, of their tariffs previously imposed on United States products. This move appears to be a preemptive measure, possibly in anticipation of the broader tariff shifts associated with Liberation Day. The actions by Israel and Vietnam suggest a strategic calculation to mitigate potential economic fallout, or perhaps to align themselves favorably ahead of the expected changes in trade dynamics. It underscores the significant impact that the anticipation of these tariffs is already having on international trade policies, even before they are fully implemented. This proactive tariff removal by Israel and Vietnam fuels considerable speculation regarding the underlying strategy. Is this a short-term tactic by the Trump administration aimed at compelling other countries to completely remove their existing tariffs on American goods? The timing certainly suggests that leveraging the threat of reciprocal tariffs could be a powerful negotiating tool. If countries perceive that dropping their tariffs might exempt them from new U.S. levies, they might be incentivized to act quickly, as seen with Israel and Vietnam. This approach would align with a transactional view of trade policy, using tariffs primarily as leverage to achieve specific concessions, like the removal of barriers to U.S. exports. However, another interpretation exists suggesting a more enduring strategic vision. Alternatively, could this be part of a more extensive long-term strategy? Some analysts propose that the implementation and threat of tariffs are not just about immediate concessions, but about fundamentally reshaping the revenue streams for the United States government. By utilizing tariffs more broadly, the administration could potentially generate substantial revenue. This increased income could, in theory, provide greater fiscal flexibility. Such flexibility might enable the administration to pursue other domestic economic goals, such as reducing other forms of taxation. For instance, the much-discussed proposal for eliminating taxes on tips could potentially be financed, at least in part, through revenue generated by tariffs. This long-term perspective views tariffs not just as a negotiating tactic, but as a tool for broader fiscal policy and economic restructuring, aiming to shift the tax burden and potentially stimulate specific sectors or income groups within the U.S. economy. Indeed, the conversation around funding mechanisms for potential tax cuts, like the No Tax on Tips initiative, brings various possibilities into focus. While tariffs could provide one revenue stream, there's also speculation about other adjustments. Some discussions suggest that the Trump administration might consider slightly increasing taxes on extremely wealthy individuals. This approach would represent a different method of offsetting the revenue loss from eliminating tip taxes or other potential tax reductions. Funding tax cuts for one group by increasing taxes on another is a classic fiscal policy debate. The use of tariffs as a revenue generator adds another layer to this complex equation. It highlights the interconnectedness of trade policy and domestic fiscal strategy. The money the government doesn't collect from previously taxed tips needs to be accounted for, whether through tariff revenue, spending cuts, or adjustments elsewhere in the tax code. The previous administration relied on that income tax revenue from tips, and any change requires a plan to manage the fiscal impact. Amidst these strategic calculations and fiscal debates, A significant development emerged this morning from our northern neighbor. Canada appears to be signaling a major shift in its stance. Reports indicate that Canadian officials, potentially feeling the pressure of the impending tariff situation and observing the actions of other nations, are expressing a willingness to relent. The sentiment conveyed is one of acknowledgement, essentially admitting defeat in the current standoff. There are strong indications that Canada is preparing to eliminate all of its retaliatory tariffs against U.S. goods. The message seems to be that the trade friction is no longer tenable. Interestingly, alongside this concession, there's a noticeable pivot towards blaming China for broader trade imbalances and issues, perhaps as a way to frame their policy shift or deflect from the direct pressure from the U.S. This move by Canada, if finalized, represents a substantial capitulation and a potential major victory for the Trump administration's tariff strategy, happening even before the reciprocal tariffs fully take effect. The swiftness of this potential Canadian policy reversal underscores the significant leverage the U.S. currently holds in these negotiations. Please remember to watch this video until the very end, as we will be drawing some important conclusions based on all these unfolding events. The specific actions Trump will take regarding Canada remain uncertain. Will he accept their offer to remove tariffs and reciprocate? Or will he maintain pressure, perhaps seeking further concessions, or viewing Canada through the lens of the broader, long-term tariff strategy? What is clear, however, is the fundamental dynamic of the U.S.-Canada trade relationship. From the outset, this trade dispute was heavily weighted in favor of the United States, provided the Trump administration maintained its resolve and didn't back down prematurely. The economic interdependence is asymmetrical. Canada relies significantly more on the U.S. market than the U.S. relies on the Canadian market. This reliance is starkly illustrated by the substantial trade deficit the U.S. has historically run with Canada, meaning they sell far more to us than we sell to them. This economic imbalance gives the United States considerable leverage. Any disruption to trade, particularly through tariffs, disproportionately impacts the Canadian economy. We knew that if Trump held firm, Canada would likely be the first to feel significant pain. The initial Canadian response involved digging in their heels, vowing to fight the tariffs and retaliate. They attempted to project strength and resilience. However, the underlying economic realities made this a difficult position to sustain long-term. The recent signals of concession from Ottawa suggest that this reality is setting in. The prospect of facing sustained U.S. tariffs, especially if they are broad-based, poses a significant threat to Canadian industries and jobs. The situation highlights the power dynamics inherent in trade negotiations between countries with differing levels of economic dependence. Trump's willingness to utilize tariffs, combined with the U.S.'s larger economic scale, created a scenario where Canada's options became increasingly limited, as long as the U.S. didn't blink first. The rhetoric initially employed by Canadian officials, including Ontario Premier Doug Ford, reflected an attempt to counter the U.S. pressure. There were threats of targeted retaliation, aimed at hitting specific U.S. states, particularly Republican-leaning ones, where it might cause political pain for the Trump administration. Suggestions were even floated about leveraging Canada's energy resources, potentially restricting power supplies. However, these threats appear to have been largely tactical posturing. The realization likely dawned that such measures could escalate the conflict further and might not be sustainable or effective against the much larger U.S. economy. The core issue remained the trade imbalance and Canada's greater reliance on U.S. trade. Therefore, a strategy based on prolonged confrontation and targeted retaliation was inherently risky and potentially self-damaging for Canada. The subsequent shift, as articulated by figures like Doug Ford, indicates a move towards de-escalation and seeking resolution. Ford's comments essentially acknowledged the unsustainability of the trade fight from Canada's perspective. He explicitly stated a willingness to remove Canadian tariffs immediately if the U.S. reciprocated. This is a clear admission that Canada cannot withstand a prolonged tariff battle. Furthermore, Ford pivoted the blame towards China, stating, "We are not the problem. China is the problem." This attempts to reframe the narrative, aligning Canada with potential U.S. concerns about China's trade practices while simultaneously signaling a desire to resolve the direct dispute with the U.S. He highlighted China's growing dominance in critical minerals, areas where Canada itself possesses significant resources that the U.S. needs. This reference implicitly points towards the potential for a renegotiated, more favorable partnership if the immediate tariff conflict can be resolved. It's a concession wrapped in an appeal to shared interests against a common economic competitor. This concession from Canada, specifically the explicit offer to drop tariffs conditional on U.S. action, marks a significant moment. It validates the strategy, at least in the short term, of using reciprocal tariffs as leverage. Whether this was the primary goal, simply forcing the removal of existing Canadian tariffs, or part of a larger plan remains to be seen. However, the immediate effect is that Canada is blinking first. They are acknowledging the economic pressure and seeking a way out by offering to remove their own trade barriers. The reference to inflation and job creation during Ford's commentary is also noteworthy. While he attempts to frame the U.S. tariffs as negatively impacting American jobs and inflation, the reality of core inflation trends in the U.S. doesn't fully support this argument currently. Inflation, particularly core inflation excluding volatile food and energy, has actually been moderating in the U.S. Projections about future inflation due to tariffs exist, but it's not the current reality he depicted. His statement about U.S. inflation being up is factually questionable in the immediate term. The concern about American jobs being hurt is also debatable, as the goal of tariffs, from the U.S. perspective, is often to protect or reshore domestic jobs, even if it causes friction internationally or raises consumer prices temporarily. The situation with Alberta adds another fascinating layer to this complex dynamic. The Premier of Alberta, Danielle Smith, has been vocal about the province's dissatisfaction with policies emanating from Ottawa, particularly under the current Liberal government. The idea of Alberta potentially holding a referendum to exit Canada, especially if Mark Carney, perceived as representing the continuation of current federal policies, wins nationally, is not mere speculation. It's being openly discussed by the province's leadership. Mark Nixon's reporting highlights this, pointing out the deep divisions between Western Canada and the Eastern political establishment. Polls already show significant support within Alberta for increased autonomy or even independence, with a notable portion favoring joining the United States. If Carney were to win, pushing policies perceived as detrimental to Alberta's energy-focused economy, the pressure for such a referendum could become immense. This potential Albexit scenario presents a unique opportunity or complication, depending on your perspective. For the United States, particularly an administration focused on energy independence and securing resources, the prospect of Alberta joining the U.S. or forming a much closer economic partnership is strategically intriguing. Alberta possesses vast energy reserves and critical minerals, resources mentioned by Doug Ford as areas where reliance on China is problematic. Integrating Alberta more closely could bolster North American resource security and energy independence. It would also bring a predominantly conservative populace into the U.S. fold, potentially altering the political landscape. However, the process would be fraught with legal, political, and economic challenges. It would require not only a successful referendum in Alberta, but also complex negotiations and agreements between Alberta, the rest of Canada, and the United States. The very discussion, however, underscores the internal pressures within Canada that the current trade tensions exacerbate. So, let's bring this all together for some conclusions. Firstly, the strategy of using reciprocal tariffs, or the threat thereof, appears to be yielding immediate results, as evidenced by the concessions from Israel, Vietnam, and now the strong signals from Canada. Ontario Premier Doug Ford's statements represent a significant public acknowledgement of Canada's difficult position and a clear offer to remove tariffs if the U.S. does the same. This can be viewed as a win for the Trump administration's approach, demonstrating the power of U.S. economic leverage when applied assertively. Secondly, the underlying motivations for the U.S. tariff strategy remain somewhat ambiguous. Is it purely about removing specific trade barriers imposed by other countries, or is it part of a larger long-term plan to generate revenue, reshape domestic fiscal policy, potentially funding tax cuts like no tax on tips, and encourage domestic production? The answer likely involves elements of both, but the full scope will become clearer over time. Thirdly, Canada's response highlights its asymmetrical dependence on the U.S. economy. While attempting initial resistance and retaliation, the economic realities forced a pivot towards concession. Blaming China is a strategic move to find common ground with the U.S. while backing down from the direct confrontation. Fourthly, the internal political dynamics within Canada, particularly the potential for an Alberta exit referendum fueled by dissatisfaction with federal policies, add a significant wild card. This internal pressure could further influence Canada's negotiating position and potentially open doors for new North American economic or even political alignments, especially concerning resource and energy security. Finally, the situation remains fluid. While Canada has signaled retreat, the final details of any agreement, or whether Trump will accept the current offer or push for more, are yet to be determined. The impact on consumers, inflation projections, and specific industries will continue to unfold. It's a high-stakes negotiation with significant implications for North American trade and potentially its geopolitical landscape. Thank you for joining us for this analysis. We hope you found it insightful. Don't forget to like, subscribe, and let us know your thoughts and where you're watching from in the comments below. We'll continue to track these developments closely.